How to stop procrastinating. In this video, I'd like to talk about procrastination, and especially chronic problematic procrastination, the kind that ends up compromising people's level of achievement, success, and overall satisfaction in life. Personally, I work as a professor in a university environment, and so I encounter many students almost on a daily basis who suffer from procrastination of this type. When my students are doing poorly in my classes and I speak with them about it, it will often eventually come out that they only started writing the paper or studying for the test the night before it was due. When I ask them why, they'll often tell me that that's just how they usually do things, that they procrastinate pretty much all of the time in all of their classes, and they've been doing that basically since they were kids. Usually, they're not too happy about it, and they realize that it's a poor way of doing things, but they feel like they just can't bring themselves to break out of the cycle. They usually feel like procrastination is the only way of life they've ever known, and that they've even grown somewhat comfortable in it over time. And anything else seems uncomfortably foreign or even impossible for them. When my students tell me these sorts of things, I feel like I know exactly what they're talking about. All I have to do is to think back to when I was their age, when I used to be an inveterate procrastinator too. However, over the years, I find that I've been able to move past most of it. Not all of it, but most of it. So, I'd like to share with you what's worked for me in this area, especially as a way of helping you work through your own struggles with procrastination. So, this video will be mostly about trying to help us all break out of the thrall of that kind of self-defeating cycle. Of course, if you're perfectly satisfied with your life in that regard, then this video probably won't be worth your time. So, anyhow, when my students lament that they procrastinate all the time, I sometimes respond with a kind of joke. I say, well, if you're so good at procrastination and you do it all the time, then why don't you just put off procrastinating? That way, logically, you'll have to do whatever it is right away. That's a joke not only because of the element of paradox, but because we hardly ever operate that way. In other words, procrastination is almost never a matter of simply realizing the self-defeating illogical nature of it. It's usually a pattern of life whose roots run much more deeply into the terrain of our lives. In other words, the real root of our chronic procrastination isn't a deficit of propositionally correct logic. It's much more about the way we habitually relate to life itself, which is what makes the task of changing it so difficult. However, when I talk further with those students, it almost always turns out that they don't actually procrastinate in every area of life. When it comes to doing things that they really want to do, surprise! They hardly ever procrastinate. For instance, when I ask them if they procrastinate when they want to open their Christmas presents, hardly anyone says, "Oh yes, on Christmas morning I'll put off opening that new Xbox till around Groundhog's Day." This is an important realization. That's because it's indicating that for the most part, we put off things that we'd really rather not be doing in the first place. So when procrastination is becoming chronically recurrent in our lives, it's probably because our lives are too full of things that we don't really want to be doing. In other words, chronic recurrent procrastination happens mostly when we're leading lives that we're not really in love with. Lives where we're mostly being dragged along by a nagging sense of external obligation rather than by our genuine heartfelt desires. In the academic world, I find that this most commonly happens when students are desperately trying to live out their parents' goals and values for them, or perhaps society's more general dictates, rather than being guided by their own deeper destinies and desires in life. So, at this level, chronic procrastination is a marker of a pervasive estrangement from the kind of lives we really want to be leading. A procrastination problem is usually a life problem in disguise. Of course, on the other hand, the hard reality is that pretty much everyone's life has an irreducible fraction of unpleasant labor in it. That's about as inevitable as death and taxes. But what makes getting through those tasks difficult is when we're living mostly in a psychological state of deficit and depletion, when life feels mostly barren and unfulfilling. In contrast, when we're living in a state of psychological abundance, when we're really living toward our deep desires, well, then it's relatively easy to take on and complete life's inevitable unpleasant tasks. In other words, when we're really in love with the totality of our lives, there's very little need to delay things, to hide from them in the furthest, most distant pocket of time, so to speak. When we've fallen thoroughly in love with our lives, it's easy to take both the pleasant and the unpleasant in stride, and hence to meet life's difficult moments with an overarching sense of joy and alacrity. So, at the most general and most encompassing level, the problem of getting past chronic recurrent procrastination is about constructing the kind of life where we're genuinely eager to encounter whatever there is to do, because we finally realize that even unpleasant tasks have their place in our experience of life. However, I realize that that's a pretty tall order, and one that's probably a matter of ongoing personal growth and metamorphosis over many years. So, I'd like to talk a bit about procrastination on the smaller, day-to-day scale. Here the question might be, how can I stop procrastinating about X today? Here, I'd like to share a bit of wisdom that I realized by teaching a graduate seminar on creativity. I often say that we teach best what we most need to learn ourselves, and that was definitely true in this case, especially since during that class I found myself experiencing a bad case of writer's block that lasted about a month into the semester. Because facing my writer's block was pretty unpleasant, it made it easy to procrastinate, which in turn, of course, exacerbated my writer's block. Basically, I was caught in a kind of vicious circle. And as often happens in the domain of creativity, I would tell myself things like, well, I just don't feel inspired right now, or I'm too busy, etc. But all of that just made things worse. The antidote turned out to be one of the things I was teaching in the class, and I just needed to pay better attention to my own wisdom. I call it the wisdom of getting your ass in the chair. This means that often the best way of getting past not feeling inspired, and then procrastinating because of it, is just to start working on whatever it is anyhow. In other words, often the best way to write a great poem, the one we really want to write, is first to write 25 crappy ones that we hate. But that probably won't happen unless we get our butts in the chair, even though we don't really feel like it, even though we aren't particularly inspired, even though it feels stupid and ridiculous, especially since we can easily find 10,000 convincing excuses for not writing today, etc., etc. The wisdom of getting our butts in the chair anyhow is that if we can manage to do that in spite of all of our good reasons not to, the muses will usually deign to visit us eventually, if only out of pity. But to do that, it's important to make peace with two things. First, to be okay with actually doing things that we'd rather not do right now, and second, to be okay with the sensation of absurdity that often accompanies disobeying our well-justified excuses for putting things off. So then the question becomes, what keeps us from doing that? Why is it often so much easier to do anything, and I mean anything, rather than the task we know we have to do anyhow? For instance, have you ever noticed how much easier it is to wash all your dishes and do all your laundry when you have an assignment that's due soon? I know I have. Anyhow, I find that the main thing that fuels procrastination is the excuses we like to generate for ourselves. So I found that getting past chronic procrastination usually involves changing our relation to the whole activity of generating and justifying excuses. Probably the most common excuse in today's world is this one. I'm just too busy right now. I have other things to do. Blah, blah, blah. Here, I'd like to share a great insight that one of my colleagues, Jeff Reber, once articulated during a faculty meeting. He said, I'm too busy really means I have other priorities. Let's repeat that, shall we? I'm too busy really means I have other priorities. So when people tell us, I'm too busy to do X for you, what they're really saying is, you don't rise high enough on my list of priorities. Similarly, when we tell ourselves that we're too busy right now to do X, it's usually a way of refusing to accept responsibility for the way we've ordered our priorities. So, when we say to ourselves that we're too busy to write that geology paper, for instance, and then end up playing 4 hours of World of Warcraft instead, what we're really saying is that World of Warcraft is our actual priority, and doing well in geology class isn't. But of course, the good news is that we can always decide to change our priorities. And so, in my experience, this whole issue of excuse making is probably the most important one if we really want to stop procrastinating. Personally, I find that one of the best analyses of the dynamics of excuse making comes from the French existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Basically, for Sartre, we make excuses for ourselves mostly because, underneath it all, we're trying to disguise the fact that we're actually freer than we'd like to admit. So instead of embracing our fundamental human freedom, we usually try to pretend, most especially to ourselves, like we have no other options, like our excuses are actually valid reasons, and that we consequently simply have to behave in a certain way. But the deeper reality is that life always offers us other options. We usually just don't like to admit it. In other words, rather than lay claim to our freedom and our power in this life, what we typically do is make excuses for ourselves, which is itself a kind of choice. That's because liberating ourselves, or more accurately, recognizing that we're already liberated, is a terrifying thing. Mostly because then we also have to lay claim to responsibility for the quality of our lives. So instead of claiming our freedom and responsibility, we usually try to skulk away into what Sartre calls bad faith, into deceiving ourselves and anyone else who might listen about what is really necessary and unavoidable in our lives. In this regard, procrastination and its attendant structure of excuses is really mostly about trying to avoid confronting the reality of our freedom and responsibility, mostly by trying to pretend like we have no choice but to be robot-like slaves to our more immediate impulses. But of course, as free agents, we could always choose not to do that. So, on the other side of the coin, getting past procrastination is mostly about becoming a liberated human being. It's about refusing to be an obedient slave to our impulses when they run contrary to what we really want in life. It's about refusing to bow down to what might feel good in the moment, but which we know will probably end up short-circuiting our deeper possibilities. So, in this regard, one way of moving past procrastination would be to allow ourselves to get sick, truly sick of acting like obedient slaves to our lesser desires, to become completely and definitively saturated with our own toxic excuses, our lies and self-sabotage, exhausted and depleted and radically discontent with all of our petty justifications and evasions, and to glimpse, in one brief, stark, and undeniable moment, how we've been truncated and twisted and torn down by it all, again and again. Because the truth of our lives is that we're freer than that, all of us. And we're deeper than that. And we're better and more brilliant than that too, even if no one else thinks so. So the only real question for us in procrastination is whether we'll have the courage to realize it and then to make that realization tangible in the concrete moments of our lives. In other words, the cost of getting past procrastination is that we need to become genuinely courageous human beings. Human beings who can feel all of the seductive allure of procrastination's pull and still refuse to be ruled by it. The question of procrastination is about whether we're content to remain its slaves, whether we want our freedom and our decisions to be forceful and genuine. From this perspective, procrastination in itself isn't our enemy. It's our habitual satisfaction with procrastination's self-enslavement that hobbles us and drags us into the whole morass of uninspired mediocrity that almost always comes along with it. That's what keeps us smaller than we really need to be. In that regard, procrastination isn't so much of a problem as it is an opportunity A real opportunity to move toward the greater depth of our lives and our possibilities as human beings. Anyhow, I would say that besides "I'm too busy," the second most common excuse for procrastinating is the whole self-perpetuating logic of, "I actually work better under pressure. I really need to be in a big, panicky 11th hour emergency to perform well." However, I've found over the years that that kind of logic is usually just another kind of excuse-driven illusion. In my experience, it's hardly ever the case that people, including myself, actually perform better when they're pulling frantic all-nighters as opposed to studying methodically and consistently over prolonged periods of time. Yeah, I've had colleagues tell me that they've written entire scintillating academic papers during cross-country airplane rides. But when I read those papers, they almost always seem like, well, like they were written during 6-hour airplane rides. Basically, there's a reason why people who are going to be in the Olympics don't start training a few days before they're supposed to compete. It's because that kind of procrastinating strategy severely compromises the quality of their performance. So I find that what people are usually saying when they claim that they can do better under pressure is that they haven't had much experience with putting their butts in the chair ahead of time. And the logic of better under pressure is mostly their way of justifying perpetuating that pattern in their lives. And like I said near the beginning of this video, that's fine if that's really how you want to live. After all, it's always possible to get by in life with a logic of excuses and suboptimal performance, especially if we have a lot of natural talent to compensate for it. But it's quite another thing to aspire to real excellence in what we do and to attain the highest degree of quality we're capable of producing, which, oddly enough, usually requires some measure of sacrifice. At this point, I'd like to inject an insight from Shunryu Suzuki's famous book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. He writes, "To live in the realm of Buddha nature means to die as a small being, moment after moment." I think that that's also true of getting past procrastination. It means sacrificing what's small within us, allowing that part of us to die, moment by moment. It means learning that real abiding fulfillment in life comes not so much out of deferring to the next available pleasure sensation, but from sustained, meaningful accomplishment over many years. But this isn't necessarily an easy lesson. It's not such a simple thing for most of us to fall in love with the possibilities of excellence that abide within us. And procrastination will always appear to be an easy way of avoiding having to confront that daunting challenge. So, perhaps at the end of the day, the real question that procrastination poses for us is, what are our lives really for? For me, a big part of the answer to that question is, life is for fulfilling our unique human possibilities. It's for learning to give birth to the best of what we can be in whatever it is that we're doing, even if it's not particularly pleasant. However, over the years, I've come to realize that that kind of orientation to life is usually an acquired taste, something that most of us have to learn through many trials and reversals over time until we eventually figure out that what life is asking of us is to be what we can be in this world. Not tomorrow, not next week, not the night before the assignment is due, but right here and right now. Mostly because, if we're honest about it in our heart of hearts, the present moment is the only time we really have. After all, we're only alive in this world for a brief and unpredictable span. So the time for us to be fully alive, to dive headlong into the vast sea of life's possibilities, to make our lives something truly luminous and poetic, that time is always now, 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 now. Not later. Yeah, sure.